My mother-in-law moved in and tried to take over my house, so I gave her a reality check she'll never forget. I never imagined that I'd be writing this story, but here I am, sitting in my perfectly arranged living room, finally able to breathe freely in my own home. It's amazing how quickly your life can spiral out of control when you let someone cross your boundaries, even if that someone is your mother-in-law. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Elena, and 3 months ago, my mother-in-law, Margaret, moved in with us after her messy divorce from my father-in-law. She showed up at our doorstep one rainy evening, mascara running down her face, clutching a Louis Vuitton suitcase that probably cost more than my monthly salary. My husband, James, didn't even ask me before telling her she could stay, as long as she needed. I should have seen the red flags right then. The first week was actually pleasant. Margaret helped with the dishes, complimented my decorating choices, and even baked her famous apple pie. But looking back, I realize it was all calculated, like a predator studying its prey before striking. By week 2, the subtle comment started. "Oh, darling, you arrange your spice rack alphabetically? How unique." I always found organizing by frequency of use more efficient. Or, James always loved his eggs over easy when he was growing up. Just a little tip. Each comment was delivered with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I tried to be understanding. After all, she was going through a difficult time. Her divorce had been brutal. Her husband of 30 years had left her for his 28-year-old yoga instructor. Classic, right? But what I didn't realize was that Margaret wasn't looking for a temporary haven. She was looking for a kingdom to rule. The real problem started when she began rearranging our house. I came home from work one day to find my carefully curated living room completely transformed. My vintage record player, a wedding gift from my late grandmother, had been relegated to the basement because it didn't match the aesthetic. My beloved botanical prints were replaced with Margaret's collection of Thomas Kincaid paintings. "The room needed a woman's touch," she said, patting my cheek like I was a child. James always loved a more traditional style. I looked at my husband, expecting him to say something, anything, but James just stood there, admiring the new arrangement. "It does look more organized, honey," he offered weakly. That night, as we lay in bed, I tried to talk to him about it. "James, don't you think your mother is overstepping? She's just trying to help, Elena. She's going through a lot right now. Can't you be a little more understanding?" Understanding. That word would come back to haunt me many times over the next few months. But the living room was just the beginning. Margaret's influence spread through our house like an invasive vine, choking out everything that made it ours, made it mine. She replaced my carefully selected organic coffee with her preferred brand, rearranged my kitchen cabinets to match her system, and even started planning our weekly meals without consulting me. The final straw came on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday. I came home early from work, exhausted from a particularly difficult client meeting, hoping to soak in a hot bath with a glass of wine. Instead, I found Margaret in our bedroom, surrounded by open boxes. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I took in the scene before me. "Oh, Elena, I didn't expect you home so early," she said, not even having the decency to look embarrassed. "I'm just doing some necessary organizing. This closet is really too small for 3 people's things." That's when I saw it. My wedding dress, my beautiful vintage lace gown that I'd spent months searching for, was stuffed into a garbage bag. "What is that?" I pointed at the bag, my hand shaking. "Oh, that old thing? Honestly, Elena, it's just taking up space. Nobody keeps their wedding dress anymore. It's so outdated. I've arranged for a donation pickup tomorrow." I stood there, frozen, as 30 years of her subtle manipulations, her passive-aggressive comments, and her complete disregard for my feelings crystallized into perfect clarity. This wasn't about helping or about going through a rough time. This was about control. And in that moment, I decided I wasn't going to let her have it anymore. Little did Margaret know, she had just started a war she couldn't win. The sight of my wedding dress in that garbage bag triggered something in me, a mix of rage, hurt, and determination that I'd never felt before. But I didn't explode. Instead, I felt an eerie calm wash over me, the kind that comes before a storm. "Margaret," I said, my voice steady despite the tornado of emotions inside me, "step away from my closet." She had the audacity to laugh. "Oh, sweetie, don't be dramatic. I'm just trying to help you declutter. You know, James mentioned just the other day how cramped the closets are getting." Of course she'd bring up James. It was her favorite move, using my husband's words, real or invented, to justify her actions. I walked over to the garbage bag, pulled out my wedding dress, and carefully laid it on the bed. The delicate lace was crumpled, but thankfully not damaged. "Did you know," I said, smoothing out the fabric, "that this dress belonged to my grandmother? She wore it in 1952, my mother wore it in 1985, and I wore it when I married your son." 3 generations of women who knew how to respect each other's boundaries. Margaret's perfectly painted lips tightened into a thin line. "Well, clearly they didn't teach you how to adapt to change. Times are different now, Elena. Modern families need to be flexible. I looked at her then, really looked at her. Margaret Sterling, with her expensive highlights and designer clothes, standing in my bedroom like she owned it. She'd always been intimidating, the successful real estate agent, the perfect mother, the woman who'd hosted legendary dinner parties in her pristine suburban home. But now I saw something else. A scared woman trying desperately to control everything around her because her own life had spun out of control. You're right about one thing, I replied. Times are different, and it's time for things to change around here. I picked up my phone and called James. When he answered, I kept my voice calm. You need to come home now. We're having a family meeting. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. She wasn't used to me taking charge. There's no need to bother James at work, she said quickly. We can sort this out ourselves. Oh, I think there's every need, I responded, sitting down on the edge of the bed. In fact, I think this conversation is long overdue. The next 30 minutes were excruciating. Margaret busied herself, organizing my closet, making little disapproving sounds every few minutes. I sat there, watching her, mentally cataloging every slight, every manipulation, every boundary she crossed since moving in. When James finally arrived, looking worried and slightly disheveled, I was ready. I'd arranged 3 chairs in our bedroom. A little detail I knew would irritate Margaret, who hated any kind of confrontation that wasn't on her terms. Sit down, I said to both of them. We need to talk about what happened today, and about what's been happening for the past 3 months. James looked between his mother and me, confusion evident on his face. What's going on? Elena, you sounded strange on the phone. Your mother tried to throw away my wedding dress today, I said flatly. She packed it in a garbage bag for donation without asking me. But that's just the latest in a long line of things that need to be addressed. Mom. James turned to Margaret, who was already crafting her defense. I was just trying to help organize. This house is so cluttered, and Elena clearly needs guidance in creating a proper home environment. I mean, look at this bedroom. The feng shui is completely off. I held up my hand. Stop. Just stop. This isn't about feng shui or organization or helping. This is about control. Since you moved in, you've rearranged every room in our house, criticized every decision I make, and systematically tried to erase my presence from my own home. I turned to James. And you've let her do it. Every time I've tried to talk to you about it, you've dismissed my concerns. She's going through a hard time, Elena. Be understanding, Elena. Don't make waves, Elena. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I didn't realize. No, you didn't. Because you didn't want to. It was easier to let your mother take over than to deal with the real issues. But that ends today. I stood up, my heart pounding but my voice steady. I'm going to make this very simple. Either Margaret moves out, or I do. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret was the first to break it, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger. After everything I've done for this family, James, are you going to let her talk to me like this? I watched my husband's face, saw him struggling with the decision. The boy who wanted to please his mother wrestling with the man who promised to build a life with me. And in that moment, as he sat there unable to give me a straight answer, I made my own decision. I see, I said quietly. I walked to my newly organized closet, pulled out my emergency overnight bag, the one Margaret had tried to throw out twice because it didn't match the bedroom's color scheme, and started packing. Elena, wait, James started, finally finding his voice. We can talk about this? We just did, I replied, zipping up the bag. And your silence said everything I needed to hear. I'll be at the Marriott downtown. When you decide whether you want to be a husband or just a son, you know where to find me. As I walked out of our bedroom, I heard Margaret's voice behind me. She's being ridiculous, James. She'll come back once she calms down. I paused at the top of the stairs, turned around, and smiled. No, Margaret. For once, you're wrong. I'm not coming back until things change. And trust me, they will change. Little did either of them know just how much change was coming. The Marriott's hotel room felt strangely peaceful that first night. No sound of Margaret's television blaring Fox News until midnight. No passive-aggressive sighs when I used the microwave instead of properly heating something in the oven. Just silence, and the faint hum of the air conditioning. I ordered room service, a burger with extra fries, something Margaret would have lectured me about for hours, and started making calls. First to my best friend, Sarah, who had been warning me about Margaret's behavior for months. Finally, she exclaimed when I told her what happened. I've been watching this train wreck for months, Elena. That woman is a textbook narcissist. I know that now. I sighed, dipping a fry in ketchup. But here's what you don't know. I've been preparing for this moment. And I had been. While Margaret thought I was just a pushover daughter-in-law who would continue to bend to her will, I'd been quietly documenting everything. Every rearranged room, every replaced item, every snide comment, all logged in a detailed journal with dates and photographs. I'd even installed a small security camera in our living room after she accidentally broke my grandmother's vase. The footage of her deliberately pushing it off the mantel while cleaning would make interesting viewing for James. Remember last month when she told James the first was wasteful with groceries? I told Sarah, well, I've been tracking our expenses since she moved in. Our grocery bill has tripled, not because of my waste, but because she keeps throwing out perfectly good food to replace it with her preferred brands. Sarah whistled. You've been playing chess while she thought you were playing checkers. Exactly. And now it's time for checkmate. My phone buzzed with incoming texts from James throughout the evening. Please come home. We can work this out. Mom's really upset. She was just trying to help. Why are you being so difficult about this? I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I opened my laptop and started composing an email. To James. Subject, what really happened while you weren't looking? I attached photos, my wedding dress stuffed in a garbage bag, the broken vase, along with security footage showing exactly how it broke, screenshots of our bank statements showing the escalating household expenses, a documented timeline of every major change Margaret had made to our home without consultation. But the coup de grace? I attached something else, something I discovered during my careful documentation process. A series of emails between Margaret and her friend Barbara, discussing their plan to help Margaret permanently move in with us. James is such a good boy, one email read. Once Elena's out of the picture, we can redecorate that whole house properly. These young wives never know how to create a real home anyway. The emails dated back to before her divorce was even finalized. This wasn't about needing a place to stay during a difficult time. This was a calculated takeover of our home, planned months in advance. I hit send at exactly 11:47 p.m., then turned off my phone. Let him sleep on that. The next morning, I woke up to 47 missed calls and over 100 text messages. Most were from James, a few from Margaret, which I immediately deleted without reading. And surprisingly, one from my father-in-law, Robert. Elena, his message read, we need to talk. There's something you should know about Margaret's divorce. I called him back immediately. Robert answered on the first ring. I saw your email to James, he said without preamble. He forwarded it to me this morning. There's more to this story than you know. What he told me next made everything click into place. Margaret's divorce wasn't because Robert had left her for a younger woman. That was the story she'd fed everyone. The truth? She'd been systematically emptying their joint accounts for months, preparing for her fresh start with their much younger landscaper. But Robert had caught on, documented everything, and filed for divorce first. The yoga instructor story was just Margaret's attempt to save face. She's always been like this, Robert said tiredly. Controlling, manipulative, always the victim. I spent 30 years walking on eggshells in my own home. When I saw her moving in with you and James, I wanted to warn you. But she'd already poisoned the well, I finished for him. Made sure any warning from you would sound like bitter ex-husband talk. Exactly. I sat down on the hotel bed, processing this new information. Why are you telling me this now? Because someone needs to stop her pattern. And Elena? You might be the first person strong enough to do it. As I hung up the phone, my hotel room phone rang. The front desk informed me that James was in the lobby, asking to come up. Should I send him up, Mrs. Sterling? I took a deep breath. Yes, I said. It's time for a real conversation. When James walked into my hotel room, he looked like he hadn't slept all night. His usually crisp button-down was wrinkled, and his eyes were red-rimmed. He was carrying my wedding dress, carefully draped over his arm. I cleaned it, he said quietly. Found a 24-hour dry cleaner that specializes in vintage clothing. I nodded but didn't speak. The ball was in his court now. I read your email, he continued, carefully laying the dress on the bed. Then I read it again, and again. I also watched the security footage. Elena, His voice cracked. I don't even know where to start. How about with why you let it get this far? I suggested, keeping my voice neutral. Why you watched your mother systematically dismantle our home and said nothing. He sank into the room's armchair, running his hands through his already disheveled hair. I talked to my dad this morning too. So you know the truth about the divorce? Yeah. He laughed bitterly. Funny how the story about Dad running off with a yoga instructor seemed so believable when Mom told it. She always could spin a good tale. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching my husband grapple with the unraveling of his family mythology. The landscaper? I prompted. Tyler. James spat out the name. 28 years old. Had been working on our property for 2 years. Dad showed me the bank statements. She'd been funneling money to a secret account for months. Thousands of dollars. When Dad confronted her, she turned it around on him. Accused him of being paranoid, controlling. Classic Mom. And you never questioned why she really needed to move in with us? She was my mother, Elena. She was crying, saying she had nowhere else to go. That Dad had left her destitute. He looked up at me, his eyes haunted. But that was a lie too, wasn't it? The prenup Dad had her sign protected most of his assets, but she got a fair settlement. More than fair. She didn't need to move in with us at all. I pulled out my laptop and opened a folder labeled Margaret's plan. Inside were screenshots of property listings, all luxury condos in our area that Margaret had been viewing months before the divorce was finalized. She could have afforded any of these, I said, turning the screen toward James. Instead, she chose to move in with us. Want to know why? Without waiting for his response, I opened the email thread between Margaret and Barbara. James read through them, his face growing paler with each message. Elena's too young to know how to be a proper wife, he read aloud. Once I'm living with them, I can show James what he's missing. These modern marriages never last anyway. God, Elena. Keep reading, I said quietly. He scrolled down to more recent emails. The house is almost mine now. Elena's so weak. She barely protests when I change things. James always did need a strong woman to guide him. Jesus Christ. Your mother wasn't looking for refuge, James. She was looking for a hostile takeover of our home, our marriage, our life. He closed the laptop, looking sick. The way she treated you. I let her treat you like that. I defended her. Yes, you did, I agreed. The question is, what are you going to do about it now? Just then, both our phones buzzed simultaneously. It was a message from Margaret in our family group chat. James, darling, when are you coming home? I'm planning a special dinner to sort out this whole silly situation. Elena, sweetheart, I think we both know you're overreacting. Let's talk this through like adults. James stared at his phone, then at me. I could see the years of conditioning warring with the truth right in front of him. She's never going to change, is she? He finally asked. No, I said softly. She's not. But you can. He stood up and started pacing the room. All these years, I thought Dad was the bad guy in their marriage. I defended her to everyone. Even when you tried to tell me something was wrong, I shut you down. I chose her over you, over and over. Yes, you did. But you didn't just leave, he said, stopping to look at me. You gathered evidence. You protected yourself. You gave me a chance to see the truth. I smiled sadly. I love you, James. But loving you doesn't mean I have to let your mother destroy me. It doesn't mean I have to set myself on fire to keep her warm. He pulled out his phone and started typing. I watched as he composed a message to Margaret. Mom, I've seen the emails. I know about Tyler, about the money, about your real reasons for moving in with us. I know everything. You need to be out of our house by tonight. This isn't up for discussion. Before he could hit send, I put my hand on his arm. Wait, I said. There's something else you need to see first. I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila envelope, my own insurance policy that I'd been building over the past few months. Before you send that message, there's more to this story. James sat back down, looking exhausted. More? How can there possibly be more? I opened the envelope and spread its contents across the hotel room's desk. Bank statements, emails, and photographs spilled out like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to an even darker truth. While I was documenting your mother's takeover of our house, I discovered something interesting. I began picking up a bank statement. Remember last month when she insisted on helping with our finances? Said she wanted to teach me proper money management? James nodded slowly. She said it would be good for us to have her expertise. Well, during her little financial management lesson, she gained access to our online banking. What she didn't know was that I installed a keystroke logger on our home computer after I noticed some suspicious transactions. I pulled up a series of transfers on my laptop. Small amounts at first, $200 here, $500 there, all going to an account I didn't recognize. In the past 3 months, she's transferred nearly $15,000 from our joint account to this mystery account. I switched to another screen. Care to guess whose account it is? James leaned forward, squinting at the name on the statement. His face went white. Tyler Matthews, the landscaper. Exactly. Your mother wasn't just planning to take over our home. She was stealing from us to fund her affair. But that wasn't even the worst part. I pulled out another document, a draft of power of attorney paperwork I'd found on our printer last week. Margaret had apparently forgotten to remove it after printing. She was trying to get control of your inheritance from your grandfather, I said quietly. The one that's coming due on your 35th birthday next month. The one worth over $1 million. James stood up so quickly he knocked over his chair. She what? The paperwork is all here. She was going to try to convince you to sign it, probably claim it was something to do with house repairs or investments. Once she had power of attorney, she could access the inheritance directly, James finished, his voice hollow. Without me even knowing. I nodded. And based on these emails with Tyler, I pulled up another conversation. They were planning to disappear with the money. Leave us with nothing. James began pacing again. But this time his movements were angry, purposeful. All these years, he muttered. All these years of her manipulation, her guilt trips, her loving control. I defended her to everyone, to Dad, to you, to myself. And the whole time she was playing you like a fiddle, I finished softly. Just like she played your father. He stopped pacing and looked at me. How did you figure all this out? Most people wouldn't have even noticed. I smiled grimly. I'm not most people. I'm an accountant, remember? Numbers tell stories if you know how to read them. And working in corporate fraud detection for 7 years taught me to spot patterns. Patterns like my mother's behavior, he said, understanding dawning on his face. Exactly. The love bombing at first, then the slow erosion of boundaries, the gaslighting, the financial manipulation. It's all textbook. I've seen it dozens of times in my work, just never expected to find it in my own home. James picked up his phone again, deleted his previous draft, and started typing a new message. Mom, pack your bags. You have 2 hours to leave our house. I know about Tyler. I know about the money you've stolen from us. I know about the power of attorney scheme. The police have been notified. You can leave voluntarily, or you can leave in handcuffs. Your choice. Before he could send it, I placed my hand over his. Wait, there's one more thing you need to see. I pulled out my final piece of evidence, a USB drive containing security camera footage from our home office. Remember last week when you couldn't find the deed to the house? The one you needed for the refinancing paperwork? He nodded. Watch this. The footage showed Margaret in our home office at 2 a.m., carefully going through our files. She removed the deed, took photos of it, then replaced it, but not before adding something to it. I had the deed checked yesterday, I said. She added her name to it, used her real estate connections to create a fraudulent document claiming she had partial ownership of our home. She was setting up a legal claim to our house. James stared at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. Without a word, he hit send on his message to Margaret. Then he started composing another message, this one to his lawyer. I want to know everything we can do legally, he said, his voice hard. Every charge we can press, every penny we can recover. I watched my husband transform before my eyes. From the dutiful son who could never say no to his mother to a man ready to protect his home and marriage at all costs. His phone buzzed with Margaret's reply. James, darling, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. He turned off his phone without reading the rest. Let's go home, he said. We have a house to reclaim. The drive home felt surreal. James gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white, while I sat in the passenger seat, clutching a folder containing all our evidence. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The time for words was over. When we pulled into our driveway, Margaret's Mercedes was still there, but something was different. Through the living room window, we could see frantic movement. She was rushing around, stuffing things into bags. She's trying to run, James said grimly. Just like she did with Dad. Too late, I replied, pulling out my phone. I already called the police. They should be here any minute. As if on cue, 2 police cruisers pulled up behind us, lights flashing but sirens silent. Detective Rivera, whom I'd spoken to earlier, stepped out and approached us. Mrs. Sterling. She nodded to me, then turned to James. Mr. Sterling, I understand you want to press charges? Before James could answer, our front door burst open. Margaret stood there, designer handbag clutched to her chest, looking nothing like the polished, controlling woman who had terrorized me for months. Her makeup was smeared, her perfectly styled hair disheveled. James, she cried out, ignoring the police officers. Darling, you can't believe these ridiculous accusations. Elena's obviously manipulated you. Stop. James's voice cut through her theatrics like a knife. Just stop, Mom. We have everything on record. The stolen money, the fraudulent deed, the power of attorney scheme, everything. Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally, her trademark victim pose. How could you do this to your own mother? She sobbed. After everything I've sacrificed for you. I stepped forward, opening my folder. You mean sacrifices like these, Margaret? I held up bank statements showing the transfers to Tyler's account. Or perhaps these? Photos of her tampering with our house deed. Or maybe this sacrifice? The power of attorney paperwork she planned to trick James into signing. She lunged for the papers, but Detective Rivera stepped between us. Mrs. Sterling, the elder Mrs. Sterling, please step back. That's when we heard it, the sound of a car racing down our street. A red sports car screeched to a halt in front of our house. Tyler, the landscaper, jumped out. Maggie, baby, what's going on? You said everything was handled. He stopped short at the sight of the police. James let out a harsh laugh. Really, Mom? You called your boy toy for backup? Detective Rivera signaled to her partner, who immediately moved to block Tyler's path back to his car. Mr. Matthews? We'd like to ask you some questions about certain financial transactions. What happened next was like watching a dam break. Margaret, seeing her carefully constructed plans crumbling, finally snapped. You ungrateful brats, she screamed. I deserved that money. I deserved this house. That little witch, she pointed at me, came in and stole everything. My son, my home, my life. No, Mom, James said quietly. You destroyed that all by yourself. As the police led both Margaret and Tyler away in handcuffs, charged with theft, fraud, and attempted grand larceny. I watched my mother-in-law's final performance. She wailed, she pleaded, she threatened. But this time, no one was buying her act. Later that night, after giving our statements and changing all the locks, James and I sat in our living room. The house felt different, lighter somehow, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. "I'm sorry," James said, breaking the silence. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I'm sorry I didn't protect you." I took his hand. "You're seeing it now. That's what matters." He squeezed my hand. "You know what's ironic? She was so worried about you taking me away from her. She never realized she was pushing me away herself." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and revelations. Margaret and Tyler both faced serious charges. The investigation uncovered more victims, other people she'd manipulated and stolen from over the years. Even Barbara, her supposed best friend, came forward with stories of financial exploitation. We recovered most of our stolen money, though the legal fees ate up a good portion of it. But it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about taking back control, about setting boundaries, about standing up to manipulation and abuse. 3 months later, I stood in our bedroom, hanging my restored wedding dress in its rightful place in our closet. The house was ours again. Every room reset to reflect our taste, our life, our love. James came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "You know what I realized?" he said, resting his chin on my shoulder. "What's that?" "When Mom said you were taking me away from her, she was wrong. You didn't take me away, you showed me the way out. You showed me what real love looks like." I turned in his arms, facing him. "And what does it look like?" "Like this," he gestured around our room. "Like trust, like respect, like standing together against anyone who tries to come between us." From our window, we could see Margaret's Mercedes being towed away, the last remnant of her presence in our lives. She was facing 5 to 10 years in prison, and Tyler had turned state's evidence against her in exchange for a lighter sentence. "What do you want to do with the room she stayed in?" James asked. I smiled. "I was thinking, maybe a nursery?" His face lit up. "Really? Really? I think it's time we filled this house with the right kind of family." As we stood there, planning our future in the home we'd reclaimed, I thought about how sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought with shouting and drama, but with quiet determination and unwavering truth. Margaret had tried to destroy our marriage, but in the end, she'd only made it stronger. And as for me, well, let's just say no one will ever mistake my kindness for weakness again.